Helldivers 2 is going through what many live service games do, at least at one point in time or another, and that's a meltdown. And it's a growing pain of many growing games, and, well, Helldivers 2 is still a growing game, and we're going to talk a little bit on that. But with the recent balance patch of Helldivers 2, many players have been upset about some of the changes that Arrowhead has made to the game, and as such, it sparked quite a few different debates and some really interesting discussions, and we're going to talk about that. So today, my friends, we are talking everything from growth, the recent balance patch, to community response, and even some really interesting takes from one of the developers on Reddit. So, as always, for freedom, for democracy, and for liberty, let's lock and load and dive in. Paul Tossi over at Forbes wrote an article about Helldivers 2 growth titled, Helldivers 2 has lost 4% of its players in 2 weeks. He goes on to write, we talk a lot about peaks and flashes in the pan and player drop-offs in gaming, but Helldivers 2 is doing some pretty weird things that we traditionally think as normal game sales curves. Circana's Matt Piscatello reports that after 3 weeks on the market, Helldivers 2 is still increasing in sales, making it an honest-to-goodness inverse decay curve at this point. Sounds like fancy I work at NPD jargon, but it's just really defying the basic logic of how most games sell. Big at launch, then quickly trailing off as time goes on, but Helldivers 2 launched big and is still getting bigger. Even if the eventual drop-off is coming, it has been floating in the air like Wile E. Coyote running over a cliff, and then it's probably going to gently sail back down to earth. That lines up at least somewhat with what we're seeing from the trackable player count numbers on places like Steam. Helldivers 2 peaked at 458,208 players on February 24th, but now it peaked at 473,000 players this past weekend. It may not be surging past those initial numbers, but its hold is positively wild, indicating that even as OG players may expire, they are being replaced by fresh new ones all the time. I got yelled at for pointing this out a while ago, but Palworld ended up losing 2/3 of its player base from its peak after 2 weeks. That was fine and good given that it just broke the record as the second highest, most concurrent played game in Steam history, and it's still widely played, but it does show a contrast with Helldivers 2, which is much more focused on long-term play and a constantly changing battlefield in a way that Palworld is not. Both are considered major surprise hits this year, but Helldivers 2, even if it's not close to matching Palworld's peaks, has a stranglehold on its player base since launch, and sales of the game are actually increasing in time. This is also before Helldivers 2 drops a major content update, which will include mechs and a bunch of other new tech and toys, and eventually another enemy faction to contend with. It's a live game, but without being annoying about it, which is also working to its advantage. We'll see how long Helldivers 2 can hold these sales and player count figures, but with what it's done so far is extremely impressive and very rare to see. Releasing a live service game in a market that's already oversaturated with live service games presents a lot of challenges, mostly due to the high level of competition within the market and the substantial amount of commitment that it requires from players. The games industry has seen a dramatic increase in the number of live service games year over year, each vying for attention and time of a finite player base with finite free time. Many players have already invested significant amounts of time and often money into their preferred titles, cultivating a sense of loyalty and attachment to those specific games. That commitment then creates a barrier for new entrants, as players are less inclined to divide their attention and resources amongst many different titles, especially as their particular game or their current game that they're playing is also growing at the exact same time that some of these other games are being released or having content added to them. For example, just recently, the finals released to a decent reception, over 240,000 concurrent players at its peak. However, player interest in the game quickly dissipated, losing half of its player base in less than a month, and it now struggles to stay over 20,000 concurrent players. It takes a lot of effort in a really great game to be able to pry interest away from other games, especially games that people are already invested in to begin with, both with time and money. But it seems like that's exactly what Helldivers 2 is doing, and Personally, I think the reason why is just because it's not free to play, because I think free to play games just have a negative connotation associated with them. We know exactly why it's free, because everything else is paid. But we look at a game like Helldivers 2, it's priced reasonably, and everything in the game, well, is on the table. You just have to play it to be able to get it. None of the battle passes expire or the war bonds or anything like that, so you can play at your leisure and you don't have to worry about other players that are outpacing you because you're not able to play the game or because you're playing something else entirely. Now, once you get that success, that doesn't mean you can't lose it. Doesn't mean you can't stumble over your own feet later on, and that's exactly what some players in the player base are thinking about Helldivers 2 right now with the game's latest balance patch. So, let's take a look at it. Looking at the key points from the balance patch, Breaker decreased magazine capacity 16 to 13, increased recoil from 30 to 55. Railgun decreased armor penetration in safe mode, decreased damage against durable enemy parts. Flamethrower increased damage per second by 50%. Laser cannon increased damage against durable enemy parts, increased armor penetration, improved ergonomics. Punisher increased total ammo capacity from 40 to 60, increased stagger force, increased damage from 40 per bullet to 45 per bullet. Breaker spray and pray increased armor penetration, increased fire rate from 300 to 330, increased number of pellets from 12 to 16 per shot, decreased magazine size from 32 to 26. Energy shield backpack increased delay before recharging. 388mm and 120mm orbital barrages increased duration of bombardment, decreased spread. Now, I think it's important to understand the intent of the developers as they want to send a clear message as to why they are making these changes and their philosophy on what game balance is. Patrick Lasota, Arrowhead's head of product testing, said in a recent developer blog post, "I have, since the game released, seen many who say, don't nerf, only buff, and other similar ideas. However, as a designer, I can tell you that this is not a great idea, but I understand where the sentiment comes from. All too often in the games industry, the core fantasy and what makes a weapon feel good and fun is ignored for the sake of balance. I believe that players are scared of nerfs because it will ruin the fantasy of the weapon, ruin their fun. It is extra important to us to tread carefully so that we don't ruin the fantasy and fun when we do nerf. We hope you, our players, will tell us when we've crossed that line inadvertently." I also want to point out the clarity that was provided on specific weapons, as I believe this helps us understand how they came to their conclusions, which not only provides us with a bit of extra context, but it makes it easier for us to challenge and agree with the changes that are made. Looking at the Breaker shotgun specifically, Patrick wrote, "The Breaker was quickly pinned down as the meta weapon, vastly overperforming other weapons and being the best choice for all Helldivers, at least if YouTube is to be believed. Helldiver veterans will remember the Breaker from the first game and how powerful it was, something that we have made an effort to mimic in this game as well. When we looked at the Breaker and the data we have on its usage, it painted a picture of a well-liked weapon that was great at killing chaff and generally had a few more kills than other weapons. It was, however, not necessarily better at making you succeed in a mission, and no real damage nerfs were warranted. The calculated total damage per magazine was quite high compared to other weapons, however, and something that could be reined in while reinforcing the intended fantasy. The fantasy of the Breaker is a powerful automatic shotgun that bucks wildly as you hose down targets in front of you. It should be deadly up close with high DPS, and its major drawback should be its ammunition management and pacing your fire so you don't overshoot your target. To that end, we lowered the amount of shells in each magazine and increased the recoil." I really appreciate the way that they're trying to start a conversation around weapon balancing, because more times than not, we don't get any context whatsoever on why they pick specific weapons, why they made the changes that they did, how they came to that conclusion. But with the developer post, with the blog post that they make, it's crystal clear. After reading the changes that they made, it makes sense why they made the changes that they did. Now, with that said, balancing and weapon balancing in general in games, especially at the very beginning of their launch, is paramount. Making sure that the game is playing the way that it's supposed to from the very start is what you want. And it takes a little bit of time to get there because you don't know exactly how players are going to play your game. But I think back to the launch of Diablo 4, many people were happy with the way that the game launched. However, when they came out with Season 1 and they nerfed every single class and ruined everybody's favorite builds, and on top of that, the first season was lackluster and the end game that the game had started with really wasn't worthwhile, well, It ruined the reputation of the game. Many players walked away from it, and still to this day, I don't think it's really recovered since then. So weapon balancing is very, very important. And a lot of people in the Helldivers 2 community have some opinions about this latest balance patch. Whether they are wrong or right, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think it's important that we look to see how people receive this balance patch. Looking at the most popular posts over on the community Reddit, one user wrote, "Don't nerf good guns, buff bad guns. The breaker was not overpowered, the other guns just aren't good. They released a balance patch. They nerfed the only 2 effective methods for combat and didn't buff any of the other weapons aside from 2 that were mostly useless before they failed to realize that the meta only existed because other options were and still are ineffective to the point of uselessness." Another user writes, "Drawback to the massive success of Helldivers 2, incessant complaining. I'm not here to write an essay or to gatekeep. I've been along for the ride since Helldivers 1, and I love Helldivers 2. I've been blown away by the amount of people who are now aware of Helldivers. That being said, there is now a massive influx of people who believe that they have the best idea of how the game should. I avoid subreddits for my favorite games, but I took a gander here to see what's up with the new patch, and my god. Are we really doing in-depth analysis of tweaks, changes, and metas? This is Helldivers, not a fucking pro gamer sweaty tournament. GTFO with the "Dear Arrowhead, you are not listening to our demands, we the people." Buddy, they've been doing this for almost 10 years. I know this will get buried, just had to get it off my chest. Another user posted, "The discourse pendulum is already swinging. Stop complaining about the railgun's nerfs. You can easily deal with a pack of 5 chargers and 3 bile titans easily with the AMR autocannon EAT-17 arc thrower spear ... Can you?" Another user writes, "The nerf wouldn't matter if the frequency of chargers wasn't so high. If you're not going to reduce the armor values, reduce their stamina so they basically can't run forever. Reduce their turn speed. Make their weak spot an actual weak spot, etc., etc. The only other way the nerf makes sense would be to reduce the sheer spam of them on higher difficulties, except we got none of that." Another user writes, "Controversial opinion, no nerfs, only buffs mentality is how you end up with power creep, which has no place in Helldivers. The popular sentiment right now is that they should not have nerfed the breaker and railgun, especially when the latter was deemed the only way to deal with chargers. However, the consequence of this mentality is that you end up with a power creep. A good example of this is Destiny 2. Weapons became so effective that players would melt entire hordes and bosses. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. For Destiny, it plays well into the power fantasy of that game, making you feel like a god, which is the goal. However, that isn't the vision for Helldivers 2. In this game, you are supposed to be expendable and feel overwhelmed. You're supposed to struggle, and maybe most controversially, chargers are supposed to be more than a minor inconvenience. I know it'll take getting used to if you haven't been using anything but the breaker and railgun. Maybe you have to temporarily lower the difficulty before you bring it back up. I think these weapons have a place in the sandbox, but maybe try other weapons too, like the arc thrower, which ignores armor, or the expendable anti-tank, which can be replenished every 70 seconds. I'm going to leave a reminder of Arrowhead's philosophy on their website and hope they stick to it instead of appealing to the masses. A game for everyone is a game for no one. I also just want to point out that I absolutely love these memes of the bugs behind a computer monitor. The railgun nerf was a good thing. If you can't deal with armored enemies without a railgun, you don't deserve it. I'll be honest, I could keep going with some of these posts because there is a ton of them, and I've really been enjoying watching the back and forth between the two parties, both the people that are defending the balance patch and the people that are against the balance patch, because I think that there's a lot of over-exaggeration on both sides, and it's entertaining, to say the least. I hopped into the game just to check it out, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't really notice the changes whatsoever. I use the railgun, I use the breaker, and I have to make my shots count a little bit more with the breaker, which I kind of like, to be honest with you. And then outside of that, when it came to trying to take down chargers with the railgun, I have always played it with safe mode turned off in the first place. So I didn't really notice any change whatsoever. So I think a lot of this is an overreaction more than anything else. And to try to keep in mind as well that this is the first balance patch for the game. There's going to be more to come. And they're probably just trying to take a measured approach. They don't want to change everything all at once. Now, there are things that I would love to see them change with the game. And I'll talk a little bit more on that later. But there are definitely things that should be changed in the future. There's some people that have some pretty strong opinions about this balance patch and also the future of Helldivers 2. But it seems like the developers, or at least one of them, is glad to respond. Frederick, one of the developers for Arrowhead Studios, started a thread on the initial balance patch, saying, a quick comment on why we decided to nerf rather than buff. We're balancing a PvE game, which means that we're balancing your power level versus the difficulty of the game, not versus other players. That means if we bring all weapons up, we would need to bring the enemies up proportionally to reach our target difficulty. We like what we see from the other weapons, so it made the most sense to bring the stronger stuff down a bit and the weaker stuff up. On a personal note, I was horrified that people were crushing the harder difficulty only a couple weeks after release. This is supposed to be a hard game. I want you to earn your success. Good luck. A user responded saying, it's just so profoundly unfun to go back to a game and find you're less powerful. If you wanted to reach some target difficulty in your head, it's on you for being so far away with it on launch. You're acting like you know best, but you didn't know your armor stats didn't work whatsoever. How much playtesting did you do? Keep your weird paternalism to yourself and actually listen to the people playing your game. Frederick responds with, sorry to hear that, but if you came to Helldiver for a power trip, you came to the wrong place. It's a meat grinder. It doesn't matter if you're level 1 or 50, you should struggle on the higher difficulties. Another user responds with, so you're doubling down, I see. Well, have fun with active player numbers dropping, I guess. Nobody wants to play run from the charger you can't kill on higher difficulties, no matter how much that fits your vision. Frederick responds with, a game for everyone is a game for no one. Another user responds, difficulty was fine before though. We just want to kill bugs and blow shit up, dude. Frederick responds with, difficulty is indeed fine. You can absolutely kill bugs and blow shit up with the stuff that we have on offer. Try the changes out and see what you think. If it's just stomping you want, I suggest dropping a difficulty or two if the higher difficulties are too hard. Our vision is that you can only clear the highest difficulty with a perfectly coordinated team that all have a specialization that synergizes with others in the group. We might not be quite there yet, but that's what we're aiming for. Another user responds with, how are coordinated groups supposed to do anything if the guns feel like a wet noodle on Helldive difficulty? A lot of the stratagems are straight up ass on higher difficulty and have absurdly long cooldowns. What's the point of even having weapons at a stage like that? Frederick responds with, people are still clearing Helldive, so I'm not sure what to say here, but skill issue comes to mind. Another user responds with, I like my games as hard as possible, but you guys are definitely going at it the wrong way if this patch is any indication of what the future holds. Nobody worth listening to is saying the game should be easier. This isn't what people are or should be upset about. Your design is just flawed. In his most downvoted comment, Frederick responds with, I'm feeding the rage a little for my own entertainment here, just so you know. We haven't nerfed anything into the ground. It's just a little too early to pretend like the game has been figured out. We made two of the most brainless playstyles less viable, and brought the guns that are under/overperforming more into line with the rest. The game is only a couple weeks old, so before we start making sweeping changes, we want everything roughly where we intended from the start. This doesn't mean we won't bring things up when we know more about how people play the game. Now, while I do find the conversation between the Arrowhead developer and players pretty hilarious, I don't think this is the right way to communicate with your audience. Players don't like nerfs, especially when there aren't enough options in their eyes. Arrowhead believes that the game should be near impossible at the highest difficulty, most likely to keep the game in balance when mechs or heavier artillery arrives soon enough, and that's causing a bit of an impasse. Sometimes you need to tell the players how it is, and sometimes you can take it too far. This thread is going too far, and I don't think this is the best way to handle it. I'm going to be honest with you guys, this is a bit of a dilemma, because I try to make sure that I'm seeing things from both sides of an argument anytime I'm talking about video games. I want to see it from the side of the developers, but then I also want to balance that with the way that the players are playing. And the way that I see it as is that the players are playing the game the way that they've been playing it, and we're comfortable doing that, and we've been having fun doing it, and now we're seeing the developers change that. And of course, we don't like nerfs, and we don't like changes like that. We're relatively adverse to change in our games in the first place, unless it's more content. And as such, the changes that they're making are too disruptive for the players. And that is at the fault of the developer. Because if they had the vision that this game was supposed to be near impossible on maximum difficulty, and the only way that you could complete it is with a highly organized team, well, that's how it should have launched. Because the problem is that player expectations are now kind of shifted in the wrong direction, at least from the developer's perspective, which is causing frustration on their side, or at least on the side of the developer, which is causing them to kind of lash out, which is a little bit odd. So I did find some of their comments kind of funny. I'm sorry, the skill check one was pretty good, but it's just not the way they handle this. Especially seeing that the community has been pretty generous when it comes to Arrowhead Studios. The servers have really only been fixed for about a week or so. There's still plenty of issues that the game already has. Armor still really isn't working the way that it's supposed to. A bunch of the other weapons, definitely, we'll talk about that, but other weapons do need work as well. So acting like fixing a couple of weapons and taking some meta crutches away from players is a power move doesn't really make a lot of sense in the context of, well, you know, how generous we've been to Arrowhead. Now, with that said, I'm not going to overreact to this. This is one guy, not the full representative for an entire company. So I'm not going to burn the house down over some comments like this. But I do see where they're coming from, that they want the game to be at a certain difficulty. And I think that makes more sense with the context of what's coming in the future. So let's talk about that. Out of curiosity, I ran a poll on my channel asking players what level of difficulty are they running on Helldivers 2, and out of 1,000 votes, only 18% of players said that they were playing on the maximum difficulty, with 42% of players playing on difficulties between 7 and 8, and the rest on lower difficulty. Now, I didn't want to use this as my only source of data, so I pulled up a Reddit post from over a week ago, and the sentiments are the exact same. Most players are playing the game on a difficulty that suits them and the kind of game session that they want to have, depending on varying factors like playing solo, playing with matchmaking, or playing with friends. I think that player concerns over the spawn rate of chargers and bile titans on 8+ level difficulty outpacing the effectiveness of some weapons is founded in some truth. I think that the game is likely being balanced around where the majority of players are playing the game, and that's not level 8 or 9 difficulty. I didn't find the game all that challenging until I hit 7+ level difficulty, and only then did I feel like the heat started to kick on. And I don't think that's how the game was intended to be, especially when the developers have plans to give us even more stratagems, mechs, and vehicles that are going to be dropping in the game's first big content patch due next Thursday. Difficulties 7 through 9 already spawn massive waves of enemies. If the rest of the balance isn't in line and they hand out more and more powerful weapons, they can't just crank up the difficulty and spawn even more enemies, because that's probably going to start to tank performance of the game. Overall, I think the balance patch would have been received better by most players if changes were made to other weapons and they had more reasons to bring them instead. The laser cannon still isn't very good, the spear still has trouble locking onto enemies, and I honestly cannot find any reason to bring the stalwart, the recoilless rifle, or the anti-material rifle on any higher difficulty whatsoever. With that said, I realize that this is their first patch. They have to collect more data, prepare to issue more content, and see how things shake out. The last thing that you want to do with a live service game is make wide-sweeping changes to how all the weapons work. We've seen how that's worked in the past for other games, and it didn't go so well. I started bouncing around different ideas about balance in my head as well once I started reading the patch notes and then seeing some of the community's response around the game. And while there are definitely some weapons that probably need a little bit of a touch-up, armor's another area where the game has some pretty big questions. I don't see any reason whatsoever to be wearing medium or heavy armor in higher level difficulties, because movement matters so much. You're always being chased by something, so always having a way to be able to get away from something and then also be able to regen all of your stamina is incredibly important. And I can't see a world in which movement is not that important, until I started thinking about the fact that they're going to be bringing in mechs and then also vehicles, which then is going to make movement a little bit less important, because we're not going to be traveling all of these long distances just on foot. Now, with that said, we also don't know exactly how this armor is going to interact with, say, using a mech or something like that. So I think that a lot of the things are probably already set in place for the balance that the game is going to sit in once some of this, well, heavier artillery is at our disposal. And again, I'm going to say the same thing. I think a lot of this is an overreaction, especially because this is so early into the game's life cycle. We're only a few weeks into the game. We're only, I think, like a week away from the game's first big content patch. And I would probably wait until that patch before we really try to cast our votes on this game or think about where the future of this game is headed. The game is still healthy. The game is still very fun to play. I haven't noticed the changes that much whatsoever, but I'll play it on a couple higher difficulties and see how I feel after that. But with that said, that's all I got for the video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you guys did enjoy the video, think about subscribing to the channel. If you didn't like that, if you didn't like the video, you can go ahead and drop a comment because you're probably going to do that anyway. But yeah, that's all I got. So if you want to support the channel, subscribe to the Patreon down below. Join the Discord if you'd like to hop in with some fellow Helldivers. Outside of that, my friends, stay cool, stay righteous, stay safe. And as always, I'll see you on the front lines. Peace.
Family, 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 family.